right, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone had a lovely weekend. We wanted to provide this webinar to give you a little bit more information and a chance to hear directly from us a little bit about your interim performance reports, a little bit more detail and clarification after what was sent out, as well as some additional information in the form of clarification for your GPRA measures. So I can't see you. I believe you can see me. I wanted to get a chance to at least greet you and say hello. I know I missed you all last fall, so hopefully this will make up for that a little bit. So what we're going to do is just run through, first of all, the interim performance report guidance and some clarifications. And then my colleague Jen Freeman is also here. She's, as you know, from the PBIS Center, and she will be sharing with you the GPRA clarifications. After that, we'll have a few minutes for questions. All right. Thank you. All right. And we can go ahead and get started.
Jen, could you just reshare your slides, please?
All right. There we go. Okay. All right. Here we go. Okay, and can we make those a little bigger? Okay. Are we able to advance those so that they are filling up the screen? Here we go. Okay. Well, as I was saying earlier, this presentation is really just to help you get a little bit more understanding of what it is that we're looking for in these interim performance reports. We want to help you understand how to submit your interim performance report. And we also want to share with you a little bit of clarification around the GPRA measures. Next slide, please. So, as you know, any grantee here at the department that has a multi-year award has to provide us with an annual report. This year, because of COVID-19 or the coronavirus, the department has some different guidance and flexibilities to provide short-term relief with administrative issues, reporting, and financial management. So in accordance with that, we are allowing grantees to submit a streamlined interim performance report, or IPR, to provide some information on project activities, as well as to request some additional information in a slightly different manner than we did before. Next slide, please. All right. So I hope everyone's aware. If you're not, the deadline is June 15th. You're going to use the exact same reports, the form, the Ed 524B that you're already familiar with. So there's nothing new there. We do have a link here where this is where you will find those forms. If you want to take a look at those templates on our Ed website. So the reporting period is October 1, 2019 through February 29, 2020. Next slide, please. So the guidance that we shared with you not too long ago provided 5 different sections really that you are going to be reporting on for your report. The very first section is here, and what we're going to do here is go through each of those one at a time, and that's going to provide you with a little bit more clarification on what we meant when we asked for these 5 different sections. Okay, so for the first section, this is where you're going to identify progress toward the goals and the objectives that you've already identified, but you're going to be doing this from a different period. This is going to be October 1/19 through February 29, 2020. We also are requesting that you provide any initial GPRA data that you have. Your full GPRA data will be due at the regular time each year on September 30th with your annual performance report. This is the interim, and given that it's interim and everything else going on, if you have that data now, that's great, please put it in. But we are expecting the full data on September 30 or by September 30 of this year. So what we want when we talk about progress of program activities, what we want is a brief description of how the pandemic has affected or disrupted program activities, if that's applicable to you, and a plan to resume and restore those grant activities, including a timeline starting 30 days after the official reopening of schools for your particular state. A brief description of the grantee's position, your position, and that's going to be individual per state, to resume and restore your grant activities or to repurpose the initial activities to support distance learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, 30 days after the official reopening of schools. We also are going to ask you to identify grant activities that were implemented prior to this disruption of the COVID-19. So here we also want you to provide a brief description of those activities and performances that are carried out during that same reporting period. Again, October 1/19 through February 29, 2020. We're also going to ask you to identify grant activities that were not implemented because of the COVID-19 disruption. Also, we're going to ask you to provide a brief description of those activities during the period of October 1, 2019 through February 29, 2020. And finally, we're going to ask you to identify, as I mentioned, a timeline. So we ask you to propose a timeline for starting and finishing the portion of the grant activities that you weren't able to implement by the start of this disruption. So that would be starting March 1. Please provide, when you send in your report, a chart or a spreadsheet showing the proposed start and anticipated finish date for each of those activities. And each of those would have to end by September 30, 2020. Next slide, please. So for number 2, this one is talking about a brief description of how this pandemic has affected or disrupted your particular program activities and the plan to resume and restore those activities with the timeline. Here, we want you to talk about progress in meeting GPRA measures. So what do we mean by that? Well, here again, if you have GPRA measures, that's great. Send us what you have so far. They don't have to be at any particular point in time in terms of progress. We would just like to see anything you do have if you've got it. If not, and whatever else you don't have now, please send that with your September 30 report. So what initial GPRA GPRA performance measures were addressed before or during the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, during that period of October 1 of last year to February 29th of this year. Here we want you to provide a brief description of the activities performed to address those performance measures. Finally, we'd like to hear from you. What is your plan to implement those activities required to meet the unaddressed GPRA measures? And just provide a list of those measures and a proposed timeline to report that data for any of those GPRA measures that you were not able to address. Again, each of these Ed 524B forms does have a section in the status chart section where it says where you can fill in some narrative. That's where you're welcome to put this information. Slide 7, please. So this is number 3. So if grant funds were repurposed to support distance learning for schools that were closed and they were moved to remote instruction, when it's an allowable use of funds, provide a brief description here of the activities that you implemented. So if grant funds were repurposed to support this new way of educating kids with distance learning, because the schools have been closed, then if it's an allowable use of funds, provide a brief description of those activities that you implemented because you had to move to this new way of sharing information for the teachers, for the staff, for the administrators. Okay, next slide, slide 8, please. So this is number 4. Number 4 talks about relevant financial data. So here you would include your budget expenditures that you have for the abbreviated reporting period that we're asking for in this grant. And in addition to that, would you please identify any carryover funds, which we all know can impact our budgets. So please, for those of you that do have carryover funds or large available balance of your current year funding, please, during that grant period that we're talking about here, October 1 through December 31 and January 1 through February 29, just provide the budget information for those time frames. Now, any grantees that are on special conditions, they need to provide a chart of both the year 1 funding, what's used and what's remaining per budget category, as well as year 2 funds that are used and remaining per budget category. Now, when we talk about budgets and financial information, we are talking about, again, just that reporting period. This is an abbreviated reporting period. Make sure you include your carryover funds, large available balances. And if you have unexpended funds that were available at the start of this COVID-19 disruption, please, March 1, please provide that dollar amount of the unexpended funds for that second quarter of performance and start that third quarter, which is what I was showing you on this slide. So if you do have a large carryover balance during the second or third quarter of your grant, let us know how you plan to use this balance. Briefly describe your plans for how the funds will be used to both resume and to complete your project activities by September 30th. And if you propose to repurpose the carryover balances to support or expand remote project activity completion, such as remote trainings, or any of those costs associated related to those activities. Briefly describe how the proposed continuation funding for your next year, for your year 3, how that amount would be adequate to support your activities. Finally, if the grant funds, again, were repurposed because of the remote situation with schools, when it's allowable use of funds, again, give us that description. So again, as you look at those Ed 524B forms, you can see that underneath where the status charts are, where you put in either your GPRA measures or your individual project measures. There's a space at the bottom. So a lot of the narrative we're asking for in the guidance, that's a good place for that to go. And next slide, please, slide 9. This is number 5 and the last of those 5 sections that we were asking you to provide for your interim performance report. Here, this is going to ask for specific written confirmation that you have the capacity to continue activities and that you do want to receive a continuation award. Now, you might think that that's obvious, but we do want you to actually specifically state both that you have the capacity to continue, but that you do wish to receive your continuation award. So make sure you make that statement that you want that third year money in your report. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jen, and she's going to talk to you about your GPRA measures to make sure, number one, that we understand them exactly the same, and also to give you some tips and some language when it comes to reporting these, even if that's going to be primarily in September. As you are collecting this data, we want to make sure that you're clear and have some tips on how to do that. Jen?
All right, thanks, Amy. As Amy just clarified, if you don't have this data at this point, that's okay. We just want to let you know kind of where we're headed with this to all be on the same page. As you know, your report will include an accounting of both your GPRA measures and your program-specific goals. For the GPRA measures, we just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So GPRA letter A, asks for the number of training and technical assistance events that your SEA provided. Just along with this in the narrative section, make sure that you provide a clear operational definition of what you mean by a training or a TA event. So you can specify that in a way that makes sense for your SEA, but please let us know what it is that you're counting. We'll give you a couple of examples of that, but provide a count of events that are substantive, that are about implementing your multi-tiered behavioral framework, and provide a list of the LEAs that were trained in each area during that year. In addition, you may want to consider providing a summary of participant evaluations to help make that GPRA measure a little bit more robust. Here are some examples of how you might count training events. So you could say we did a webinar focused on our multi-tiered behavioral framework content. That is one event. Same thing for a 2-hour training or a 1-hour conference call, whatever it is, just make sure you specify what it is that you're counting and help us understand what that event is so that we can make sure that those make sense across sites and we can compare one state's numbers to another based on your definitions. For GPRA measure B, it is asking for the number and percent of schools in the LEAs that were provided training or technical assistance in order to implement this multi-tiered behavioral framework. So you're going to need to report the number and percent of schools within each LEA that were trained. In order to do that, you'll need to tell us the total number of schools within the LEA and then the percent of which were trained. So make sure you give us both the numerator and the denominator of that equation. And then if possible, also provide a list of the schools that were trained in each area. So if you did tier 1 training or tier 2 training, let us know which schools were trained in each area during that year, because that, again, will allow us to make some comparisons across states and to be able to tell the larger story of the impact that this program is having for your schools. For GPRA-C, this is asking for the number and percent of LEAs that are provided training that are able to implement a multi-tiered behavioral framework with fidelity. And this one's a little bit tricky because there's not actually an established criterion for LEA fidelity of a multi-tiered behavioral framework. It's really a school level construct. So in this measure, we're going to ask you to report the number and percent of schools that are implementing their multi-tiered behavioral framework with fidelity. We've defined that as schools that are implementing at least tier 1 at criterion should be counted in this measure. So if, for example, you're using the tiered fidelity inventory, tier 1 fidelity criterion is 70%, you would tell us the number and percent of schools that had hit at least a 70% on that tiered fidelity inventory for this measure. In addition, though, please provide scores, implementation fidelity scores across the advanced tiers. So if you also have a tier 2 or a tier 3 score, provide that. But in order to count for this GPRA measure, schools only need to be implementing tier 1 at criterion. One good way to summarize this would be in a table with annual scores across all tiers for each school, for each supported LEA. That would help us be able to drill down into your data. And in addition, because this measure really is asking about district level fidelity or LEA level fidelity, consider using one of the measures that get at that. The district systems fidelity inventory or the district capacity assessment are both measures that capture the district's capacity, the systems that help support multi-tiered behavioral framework implementation at the school level. So those would be excellent additional measures to include with respect to this measure. At this point, we're going to spend a little bit of time on questions and answers. Amy is going to answer your questions. If you have questions that weren't addressed in the presentation, go ahead and put them in the Q&A section, and we will do our best to answer them before we log off today.
We did a really good job. We don't have any questions.
In the published section, do you want me to read out questions for you, Amy? Would that be easiest?
Yeah, that
All
might
right.
be easy.
The first question is, when we discuss how the pandemic has affected the program, is it in real time or up until February 2020? I'm assuming it's the former.
Yeah, it's just through the reporting period. Now, when you're talking about how you are planning to meet some of the goals that were interrupted and you're projecting forward, then you can include that information. But when we're talking about answering those particular questions for that time frame, it's just the reporting period.
Okay, and this one's related, but it says the pandemic hit states in March after the February 29, 2020 reporting period. Do you anticipate that funds would be repurposed during the 10/1 to 2/29 period?
Well, I think now the funds are kind of what you're going to be doing moving forward, right? So the funds would be, you're reporting on the funds during the reporting period, but going forward, you may be dealing with those disruptions because March 1 until the report is due, obviously, there's a pretty big time gap there for your planned activities. So if I'm understanding correctly, while we are indicating that it's going to be starting on March 1 in terms of the major effects from the COVID-19, we're aware that those effects started for some people in February and some before possibly. But if your funds haven't been affected, you report that. But we do understand, number one, the gap between the March 1 and the June 15 deadline, as well as your projections going forward to September 30 being affected. So just report that.
Great. The next question says, are we reporting GPRA data only or also project-specific data?
We're reporting both. We wanted to provide you clarification on GPRA data because that applies to everybody, and because looking at year one reports, some people are interpreting them differently. So we wanted to make sure that everyone understands them clearly, is gathering the data and providing the information in a way that is consistent. All of your GPRA measures are rolled up and reported to Congress. So it's really important that, and that's done annually. So what we need to do is make sure that everything is understood, being reported consistently, so that we actually have something coherent to provide to Congress that we're responsible for to provide this data to.
All right, next one, do we need to complete the Ed 524B cover sheet as well?
Yes.
All right, that's a quick answer. When calculating the number and percent of LEAs, are we looking at the LEAs in the state or just the ones we train?
Just the ones that are involved with your project.
This next one, I think I can answer. Is it required that the districts do the TFI or the specific district capacity assessment to measure fidelity? That was just an example that I provided of a common measure. That is not the required measure. You do need to measure multi-tiered fidelity of implementation of your multi-tiered framework, but it does not need to be one of those tools. Those were just examples that I provided. Next question, our planned activities we report through 6/15 when the report is due, or through 9/30?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. When reporting planned activities, is that through 6/15, June 15th when the report is due, or going through September 30th?
That's a good question. I believe it would be through the reporting period. Let me get back to you on that to make sure, and I'll send that response back to everybody.
Great. We have continued to draw down funds during the pandemic due to staffing, contracts, et cetera. So our amount of available funds will not be accurate. Should we give the amount we have available March 1st, or the amount we anticipate having left at the end of the fiscal year?
For the report here, just give what you had through February 29th.
All right, and then can you speak to why the performance period is truncated, especially if it's being reported to Congress? Will the period be clarified in the larger report?
We are only reporting GPRA measures that we receive complete in September. So for the September 30, we're not going to report anything that's provided for the interim. We are asking you to provide it if you have it. If you don't have it, you don't have to. If it's partially there, you can report that. But the GPRA measures are going to be looked at in September in terms of getting them prepared for Congress. So it's not two collections. It's just a continuation of the collection that you're already doing. So you're only going to be looked at in terms of the finality of your GPRA measures in September. That's all that's going to be reported to Congress.
All right, next question. Regarding GPRA B, we will have many schools within many LEAs receiving training. The question is about calculating the percentage. Do we report LEA specific percentages in a list, or do we total the number of schools in the LEA that receive training and then calculate the percentage as a proportion of schools trained within the total number of schools within participating LEAs?
So based on your guidance today, Jen, your explanation, how would you respond to that one?
Yeah, so the question is the number and percentage of schools in LEAs that are provided training or technical assistance. So I think you're going to want to report both the percent of schools within each LEA and a program total, a percent of, so if you've got, for example, 5 districts participating in your state project, and District A, 30% of schools were trained, District B, 50% of schools were trained, give us that information, but then also give us a project total. Does that align with your understanding, Amy?
Yep, that makes sense.
Next question, when will we be notified of funding, including carryover?
In terms of your year 3 funding, that should come in the summer. We are hoping to have all continuation funds completed at the very end of July.
All right, at the moment, I do not see more questions.
Okay. You all are also welcome to email me, and I'll respond to you as well. If something comes to you later, or you think of it a little bit later on, if it's something I think applies broadly, then I'll not only respond to you, but I will send the question and answer out to the group.
And just to make sure we've said it orally as well, the video and the slides for this presentation will be posted at pbis.org in the School Climate Transformation Grant section within the next day or so, as quickly as we can get things uploaded.
Okay. Any last questions?
Nope, yep, we sure do. GPRA-C is the number of schools in this measure, those implementing with fidelity, a subset of the number of in GPRA-B. Yes, that would be assuming you tell us the percent that were trained and then the percent that have reached fidelity. So that is completely accurate. And that is the end of the questions that we have at the moment.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for your time today and being flexible. I know we moved the date on you. Thank you also for your questions. There's one I'm going to get back to the group with. And again, if you have further questions, please email me. I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. All right, if that's it, thank you very much.